The name missing from the acknowledgments. Chapter 1. The chair without my name. My name is Serena Campbell. I am 32 years old, and for the past 17 years, my family has systematically treated my existence as an administrative inconvenience and my intellect as an unpaid public utility. I was not abused with raised voices, physical threats, or shattered glass. I was erased through polite suggestions, cropped photographs, and perfectly curated lies. They believed that because I remained quiet, I was willingly surrendering to my own humiliation. They mistook my observation for compliance and my patience for weakness. But a quiet room is not always a defeated one. Sometimes, it is simply a space where the truth is waiting, gathering every receipt, every timestamp, and every audit log, ready for the perfect moment to dismantle the stage they built on my back. The Grand Hall at the Royal College of Surgeons in London was a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, illuminated by heavy crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, golden glow over the assembled elite of the medical community. Waiters in immaculate black vests moved silently between the circular tables, filling long-stemmed glasses with vintage champagne. It was an evening designed to celebrate brilliance, precision, and the saving of human lives. I sat at table 4, positioned directly in front of the main stage, observing the precise geometry of my own public erasure. Directly in front of my designated seat rested a thick, cream-colored place card with elegant calligraphy. It read simply, Serena V. There was no surname. There was no professional title. There was certainly no mention of my role as a clinical data analyst at St. Cuthbert's NHS Trust. To my immediate right, a remarkably different place card stood proud and complete, Dr. Theodore Hartwell, Surgical Innovation Fellow candidate. Theo, my stepbrother, was currently leaning against a velvet-draped pillar a few yards away, wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo and accepting premature congratulations from a group of junior surgeons as though he had personally cured a plague. My father, Dr. Malcolm Campbell, sat beside me, rehearsing his acceptance speech in his head. He was the institution's celebrated cardiovascular surgeon, a man whose hands had repaired hundreds of failing hearts, yet he could barely meet my eyes tonight. Beside him sat his wife, Celia Hartwell. She reached over, her manicured fingers gently adjusting the lapel of my father's dinner jacket, her voice a soft, calculated murmur. She reminded him not to speak too heavily about the technical data, insisting that the donors and the press preferred a compelling human narrative over dry statistics. I picked up the glossy event brochure resting beside my water glass. The heavy paper felt smooth beneath my thumb as I turned to the page highlighting the evening's main award. My eyes scanned the polished paragraphs until they landed on the bolded text. The project I had painstakingly built from the ground up over 3 exhausting years was officially listed as the Campbell-Hartwell Surgical Insight Initiative, inspired by Dr. Theodore Hartwell. My name did not exist on the page. I had been completely written out of my own professional legacy, replaced by a young man whose primary contribution to the medical field thus far was his photogenic smile. Celia noticed my gaze lingering on the brochure. She offered a warm, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes, reaching into her designer clutch to retrieve a thin, folded document. She slid it smoothly across the linen tablecloth until it rested perfectly aligned with the edge of my dinner plate. It was an authorship clarification form, bearing the official letterhead of the Research Foundation. "It is just a standard administrative formality," Celia whispered, her tone carrying the gentle, soothing cadence one might use to placate a difficult child. "Just sign it before the ceremony begins, Serena. Tonight is about your father. Let us not make things unnecessarily complicated." I looked down at the neatly typed lines. The document required my signature to legally verify that Theodore Hartwell was the primary co-author and lead data architect of the initiative. Signing it would permanently surrender my work, my countless hours of coding, and my professional integrity to a man who did not even know how to properly log into the hospital's raw data repository. I did not reach for the pen she had thoughtfully placed beside the paper. I simply folded my hands in my lap, feeling the solid, comforting weight of my leather purse resting against my leg. Inside that purse was a small, silver encrypted hard drive containing every piece of truth this room was trying to ignore. They thought they had cornered me in this grand room, trapped between the blinding lights, the imminent applause, and the crushing weight of family expectations. What they didn't know is that the silver drive in my purse was about to make the entire room go quietly, devastatingly still. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it started. Chapter 2. The smell of fresh paint after a funeral. My understanding of systems, memory, and the importance of accurate records did not begin in a university lecture hall. It began with my mother, Margot Campbell. She was a senior surgical nurse, a woman who possessed a sharp intellect and a profound intolerance for careless mistakes. I was 17 years old when she suffered a massive, fatal stroke. Before she passed, she spent years teaching me how to observe the unseen mechanics of a hospital ward. I can still hear her voice, calm and unyielding, explaining her philosophy as she reviewed patient charts at our kitchen table. In a hospital, Serena, the things people fail to write down are always the things that will eventually kill someone, she used to say, tapping her pen against a stack of files. What isn't documented is the most dangerous thing in the room. When she died, the silence she left behind in our Islington home was suffocating. My father, entirely unequipped to handle the messy, unpredictable nature of profound grief, threw himself entirely into his surgical schedule. He became a celebrated ghost in his own house, leaving before the sun rose and returning long after I had gone to bed. I learned to cook my own meals, manage my own school schedule, and sit in the vast, echoing kitchen without making a sound. Exactly 1 year after the funeral, Malcolm married Celia Hartwell. She was a highly successful medical public relations consultant, a woman who navigated life with ruthless grace. She arrived at our home wearing a soft cream trench coat and an aura of absolute control. She was a master of optics, always knowing exactly when to place a supportive hand on my father's shoulder when a camera flashed at a hospital charity event. Along with Celia came her 10-year-old son, Theo. From the very beginning, my erasure from the household was not accomplished through shouting or obvious cruelty. It was a slow, systematic renovation of reality, executed with the precision of a public relations campaign. I tried to be accommodating at first. I quietly surrendered the large oak desk in the study to Theo because Celia insisted he needed a proper environment to prepare for his future medical school entrance exams. Shortly after, the room that had been my mother's private reading sanctuary was repainted a sterile, modern gray and transformed into Celia's media office. I came home from school one afternoon to find all of Margot's nursing textbooks packed neatly into brown cardboard boxes, stacked by the back door like garbage waiting for collection. When I asked about the framed photograph of my mother that usually sat on the mantelpiece, Celia offered a sympathetic, deeply toxic sigh. "We put it away for now, darling," Celia said smoothly, pouring herself a cup of herbal tea. "Seeing her face every day is just keeping your father anchored in his trauma. We must help him look forward. Don't make this uncomfortable for him. He has already lost so much." I was never explicitly told that I did not belong. Instead, I was managed. Whenever I achieved something academically or handled a crisis on my own, Celia would use it to justify my isolation. "Serena is so fiercely independent. She doesn't need anyone to fuss over her," she would tell visiting relatives, weaponizing my resilience. In the very next breath, she would excuse her son's poor grades or demanding behavior by saying, "Theo is incredibly sensitive. He just needs a stable family foundation to thrive." I watched my mother's footprint fade from the house, replaced by the smell of fresh paint and the carefully curated narrative of a perfect, blended family. I realized then that I was no longer a daughter in my own home. I had been quietly demoted to the role of a polite, low-maintenance guest. Chapter 3. The daughter too competent to be loved. When it came time for university, I did not follow my father into the operating theater. The sight of blood did not frighten me, but I found my comfort in the absolute, undeniable honesty of numbers. I chose to study statistics and health informatics at University College London. When I handed my father my acceptance letter, he looked at it for a long moment before offering a tight, polite smile. It was a very specific kind of disappointment, the kind wrapped entirely in a compliment. "Well, analyzing data is certainly important work," Malcolm said, handing the letter back to me. It is not quite the same as having a patient's life directly in your hands, but hospitals always need good administrative support. Theo, on the other hand, was destined for the medical pedestal, regardless of his actual aptitude. His journey into medical school was heavily subsidized by Celia's relentless networking, expensive private tutors, and my father's glowing letters of recommendation. Theo was not inherently malicious, but he possessed the deeply ingrained entitlement of someone who had never been allowed to fail. He loved the aesthetic of being a doctor, the prestige, the white coat, the respect, far more than he respected the grueling discipline the profession demanded. After completing my master's degree, I accepted a position as a clinical data analyst at St. Cuthbert's NHS Trust, the very same hospital where my father served as the star surgeon. My job involved reading through audit logs, tracking patient safety metrics, and identifying systemic failures. During my second year, while combing through thousands of digital patient records, I noticed a subtle but terrifying anomaly. There was an inconsistent classification of post-operative complications across the surgical wards. Nobody was intentionally falsifying records, but the fragmented way data was entered meant the hospital was entirely blind to a dangerous pattern. I discovered that a specific set of respiratory complications spiked dramatically during weekend shifts, directly correlating with a specific rotation of post-operative care nurses who were severely understaffed. Working late into the night for several months, I independently built a comprehensive internal dashboard. It cross-referenced patient assay scores, medication logs, staff rotas, and response times to flag potential risks before they escalated into critical emergencies. I did not build it to win an award or to step into the spotlight. I built it because I remembered my mother's warning. I knew that a single overlooked metric in a spreadsheet was, in reality, a patient lying in a bed, suffocating quietly while a nurse was busy down the hall. When I first showed the functional prototype to my father in his private office, he genuinely understood its value. He reviewed the predictive models, his eyes widening as he saw how clearly the data predicted the weekend failure rates. "This is extraordinary work, Serena," he said quietly, looking at me with a rare, unfiltered pride. "You truly have your mother's mind for details." But that private validation evaporated the moment the dashboard was introduced to the hospital board. During the quarterly departmental review, Malcolm stood in front of the executives and presented the system to secure funding for its hospital-wide implementation. I sat at the back of the conference room, taking notes, waiting for him to explain the architecture I had designed. By integrating these variables, we can anticipate the complication before the patient even leaves the recovery room, Malcolm announced smoothly to the nodding board members. He then gestured vaguely toward the back of the room. My daughter, Serena, was kind enough to help me organize some of the spreadsheets and background numbers to get this off the ground. I stopped writing. Organized some of the spreadsheets. He had taken a complex, bespoke data architecture that I had engineered from scratch and reduced it to the administrative chore of a helpful daughter. I did not stand up. I did not interrupt his presentation. I remained perfectly still, realizing with a cold clarity that my family did not merely underestimate my competence. They viewed it as a natural resource, something to be quietly harvested for their own benefit, while keeping my name safely out of the light. Chapter 4: How a Name Disappears. The erasure of a person's work rarely happens in a single, violent stroke. It is not a sudden theft in the middle of the night. In my experience, professional erasure is a gradual, bureaucratic process executed through polite suggestions, minor editorial revisions, and the quiet shifting of organizational margins. By my third year at St. Cuthbert's NHS Trust, the internal dashboard I had built was no longer a theoretical model. It was saving lives. The metrics were undeniable. Early detection of postoperative respiratory distress had increased by 22%. The average response time of the critical care outreach team during weekend rotations had dropped by 4 crucial minutes. I had spent countless evenings staring at glowing monitors, writing algorithms that translated scattered nursing notes and fluctuating vital signs into a cohesive, predictive risk score. Because the data was so compelling, the head of clinical governance requested a formal proposal to roll the dashboard out across the entire surgical division. I drafted the 70-page document myself, pulling the final data queries and formatting the operational guidelines. The original title page of the internal report was perfectly straightforward, formatted exactly according to hospital policy. Project title: Predictive Modeling for Postoperative Complications. Lead Analyst, Serena Campbell, MSc. Clinical Sponsor, Dr. Malcolm Campbell, FRCS. I sent the draft to my father for his final review on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Celia had involved herself. Although she was technically a public relations consultant for the trust and had no clinical oversight, she treated my father's professional output as her own personal brand portfolio. She invited me for coffee in the hospital atrium, placing a printed copy of my title page on the small glass table between us. There were elegant red circles drawn around the text. "It is a brilliant piece of work, Serena, truly," Celia began, her tone saturated with that practiced, maternal warmth she reserved for public spaces. "But the title is terribly dry. If your father is going to present this to the board for funding, we need a narrative. We need something that sounds like a legacy." She slid a revised piece of paper across the table. The new title read, "The Campbell Surgical Insight Initiative." I pointed out that the new title completely obscured the actual function of the software. Celia merely laughed, waving her hand dismissively as if I had made a charming but naive joke about the adult world of marketing. She insisted that hospital boards did not fund algorithms, they funded visionaries. I let the name change happen. I rationalized that as long as my name remained explicitly clear in the authorship section, the branding of the project was a secondary concern. That was my first mistake. 2 weeks later, Theodore began his surgical rotation at St. Cuthbert's. He was a junior resident, fresh out of medical school, spending most of his days trailing behind senior consultants and looking impeccably exhausted in his tailored scrubs. Celia casually suggested during a Sunday dinner that Theo should sit in on our implementation meetings. She framed it as an invaluable educational opportunity, a chance for a young doctor to understand the future of medical technology directly from his esteemed stepfather. Theo attended exactly 2 meetings. For the first, he arrived 20 minutes late, holding an iced matcha latte and checking his phone. He sat at the back of the conference room while I walked the clinical leads through the data infrastructure. For the second meeting, he actually spoke. Right as I was explaining how the dashboard weighted the American Society of Anesthesiologists' physical status classification, the ASA score, against patient age, Theo raised his hand. "But shouldn't we just be looking at their blood pressure during the surgery?" he asked, a confident smile on his face. It was a question that demonstrated a fundamental failure to grasp what predictive modeling even was. I had spent the first 10 slides explaining that intraoperative vitals were already accounted for in the baseline data. The room fell briefly, awkwardly silent. My father quickly stepped in, smoothly pivoting the conversation to praise Theo's clinical intuition before hastily moving on to the next slide. I thought nothing of it until the hospital's internal communications team requested a photo op to accompany the announcement of the initiative's funding approval. The photographer set up his lighting equipment in my father's office, asking us to stand in front of a large monitor displaying my dashboard. I stood beside my father, ready for the shot, when Celia stepped into the room. She immediately took charge of the framing. "Serena, darling, your dress is clashing just a bit with the background on the screen," Celia murmured, gently placing her hands on my shoulders and physically shifting me out of the camera's primary focus. "Let's have Theo step in next to Malcolm." The whole passing the torch imagery is exactly what the newsletter editor loves. You just stand right over there, maybe point at the screen from the side. When the hospital's monthly digital newsletter was published in my inbox the following Monday, I did not need to search for the article. It was the cover feature. The photograph featured my father and Theo standing shoulder to shoulder, looking thoughtfully at a data visualization I had coded. I had been cropped out of the frame entirely. The headline read, "A Family Affair, Innovating Patient Safety." I scrolled down to the text, my eyes scanning the polished corporate prose. One specific paragraph anchored itself in my chest. Dr. Malcolm Campbell and his protege, Dr. Theodore Hartwell, are exploring bold new ways to improve surgical safety. The Campbell Surgical Insight Initiative represents a generational commitment to patient care, combining decades of surgical mastery with fresh, innovative perspectives. The clinical team is supported by data support staff, including Serena Campbell. Supported by data support staff. I had built the entire architecture. I had written every line of the analytical model. I had spent 3 years turning chaotic hospital records into a functional early warning system. And I had just been officially documented as unnamed support staff in my own project. I did not storm into the PR office. I did not call Celia to scream. I opened a new email window, addressing it to the communications director, CCing my father and the hospital's governance board. I wrote a perfectly polite, entirely factual request for an immediate correction to the article, attaching the original project charter and the metadata logs that proved my sole authorship of the system. I stated that accurate professional attribution was not a matter of preference, but a requirement of research integrity. I pressed send and waited. No reply came from the communications director. Instead, 3 hours later, my father walked into my small, windowless office in the basement of the administrative wing. He closed the door behind him and stood near my desk, looking deeply fatigued. I saw your email to the communications team, he said quietly, avoiding direct eye contact by examining a stack of folders on my filing cabinet. You are making a mountain out of a molehill, Serena. It is just an internal newsletter. It is a marketing piece. It is a published document attributing my 3 years of work to a junior resident who does not understand the basic variables of the model, I replied, my voice remaining entirely level. I did not push away from my desk. I kept my hands resting on my keyboard. Malcolm sighed, the heavy, practiced sigh of a man burdened by unreasonable people. Theo is trying to build a foundation for his career. This hospital values team players. Don't be petty, Serena. Everyone who matters knows you contributed to the background work. I looked up at him. I looked at the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle, who had held my mother's hand as she died, and who was now standing in my office asking me to willingly participate in my own professional funeral. If everyone knows, I said, looking directly into his eyes, then writing my name down shouldn't be difficult. My father did not have an answer for that. He stood in the oppressive silence of my small office for a long moment, the hum of the hospital's ventilation system suddenly very loud. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, closing the door firmly behind him. It was in that precise moment I realized the truth. My family had not simply forgotten my name. They had decided it was in their best interest to erase it, and my silence was no longer keeping the peace. My silence was making me an accomplice. Chapter 5. An Invitation to Make Peace. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon, disguised as a casual digital calendar event accompanied by a brightly punctuated text message from Celia. She wrote that my father was feeling quite sentimental about the upcoming awards gala, and that they would absolutely love to have me over for a proper Sunday roast to celebrate together as a family. It was a remarkably unusual gesture that immediately set my professional instincts on edge. For the past decade, my summons to the family home in Islington had been strictly utilitarian in nature. I was typically only invited over when the home network router needed resetting, when my father required someone to untangle a complex statistical analysis for a grant proposal, or when a family financial document needed a meticulous second set of eyes. A dinner dedicated purely to sentimental family bonding was a warning sign wrapped in expensive social etiquette. I decided to attend anyway, driving through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Islington on Sunday evening with a growing sense of clinical detachment. When I stepped through the front door, the first thing I noticed was the absolute eradication of the past. The house did not simply look different, it felt as though it had been scrubbed of its original history. The hallway where my mother's heavy wool winter coats used to hang was now adorned with large, abstract canvases that Celia had purchased from a gallery in Mayfair. The rich, lived-in smell of old paper and baking spices that used to permeate the lower floor had been entirely replaced by the sharp, synthetic scent of high-end citrus room diffusers. My father was standing by the fireplace in the living room, pouring a glass of red wine, while Theo sat comfortably on the velvet sofa, scrolling through his phone. Before either of them could properly greet me, my eyes were drawn to the newly arranged mantelpiece. The space that had once held my university graduation photograph and an old picture of my parents on vacation in Cornwall was now dominated by a large, gleaming silver frame. I stepped closer to examine it, my posture remaining perfectly relaxed even as the air in my lungs turned cold. The photograph featured my father and Theodore standing side by side in a hospital corridor, both wearing their white coats, smiling warmly at a piece of medical charting. It was a beautiful, professionally lit portrait of a mentor and his protege. Beneath the glass, a small engraved plaque was embedded into the silver frame. It read, in elegant serif typography, "2 generations of healing." I stared at the engraved letters until the glare of the recessed ceiling lights made my eyes water, committing the exact phrasing of the inscription to memory. I was the daughter who shared his blood, the analyst who had built the very system that was currently elevating his career to its absolute peak, and yet I was not part of the generational legacy. That mantle had been formally transferred to a young man who had simply married into the address. "Ah, Serena, you made it through the traffic," my father said, finally noticing my presence and offering a stiff, rehearsed smile. He handed me a glass of water, deliberately avoiding any mention of the photograph I was staring at. Before I could respond, Aunt Rosalind walked into the living room from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a linen towel. My father's younger sister, Rosalind, was a retired head surgical nurse who possessed an incredibly sharp mind and a complete lack of patience for bureaucratic nonsense. She was the only remaining thread connecting me to the reality of my mother. She offered me a warm, grounding smile, though her sharp eyes darted quickly between the silver frame on the mantelpiece and my calm expression. She recognized the structural cruelty of the room immediately, but like a seasoned veteran of hospital politics, she chose to observe rather than intervene prematurely. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, a space Celia only utilized when she was actively trying to manage an outcome. The roasted lamb and rosemary potatoes were passed around the mahogany table while Celia smoothly curated the flow of conversation. She steered the topics away from anything controversial, focusing intensely on the upcoming gala at the Royal College of Surgeons. She spoke about the guest list, the media presence, and the potential for my father to be invited onto the advisory board of a highly lucrative private research foundation. "It is going to be a rather pivotal evening for all of us," Celia announced, taking a delicate sip of her wine and resting her hand affectionately on Theo's arm. "Especially for Theodore. The selection committee for the Harrington Surgical Fellowship will be sitting at the head table. They pay very close attention to these awards, and a strong association with your father's data initiative will make his application absolutely undeniable." Theodore puffed his chest out slightly, adjusting his collar with a look of practiced humility. "I just hope the committee recognizes the practical, clinical applications of what we've been working on," he said, using the collective pronoun with a remarkable lack of hesitation. Aunt Rosalind paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, her gaze drifting slowly toward me before she looked back at Theo. She did not say a word, but the slight tightening of her jaw communicated volumes. She knew exactly whose hands had touched the raw data, and it was certainly not the young man currently attempting to sound like a seasoned researcher. Celia dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin, her eyes finally locking onto mine across the table. Her voice softened, taking on the gentle, reasonable tone of a woman asking for a minor, universally beneficial favor. "This is why it is so crucial that everything goes smoothly on Thursday night," Celia said, offering me a smile that felt entirely structural and entirely devoid of warmth. "The press, the fellowship committee, the hospital board, they are all looking for a cohesive narrative. It would be wonderful if our family presented a unified front." I placed my knife down onto the edge of my porcelain plate, ensuring the silver did not make a single sound against the ceramic. I looked at her, keeping my expression completely neutral, refusing to offer the polite, agreeable nod she was waiting for. "A unified front," I repeated calmly, letting the phrase hang in the quiet air of the dining room. "Could you clarify what that means exactly in the context of a medical research award?" My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearing his throat and looking down at his remaining food. Theodore suddenly found his wine glass fascinating, tracing the rim with his index finger. Only Celia maintained direct eye contact, her smile hardening just a fraction of a millimeter. "It simply means that we support each other, Serena," Celia answered, her tone remaining light and conversational, though the underlying instruction was unmistakable. "It means that we stand together, and we do not make the evening difficult by complicating the story with unnecessary details." I looked from Celia's calculated smile to my father's averted gaze, and finally to the empty space on the wall where my mother's portrait used to hang. I understood exactly what was happening. I had not been invited to this table to heal family wounds or to share in the celebration of a professional milestone. I had been invited here so they could politely ask me to arrange my own professional disappearance, ensuring that the stage was perfectly clear for the people who truly mattered. Chapter 6. The thin stack of papers on the dining table. The transition from the roasted lamb to the dessert course felt less like a natural progression of a family evening and more like a carefully timed theatrical cue. Aunt Rosalind gathered the empty dinner plates with a rigid, almost mechanical efficiency, her persistent silence communicating a profound disapproval of the atmosphere Celia had constructed. Celia, however, did not allow the carefully managed momentum of the evening to falter. As soon as the porcelain coffee cups were distributed and a polite, tense quiet settled over the mahogany table, she reached down beside her chair and retrieved a sleek, black leather folio. She opened the folio and extracted a remarkably thin stack of papers, secured at the top corner by a single silver staple. With the practiced grace of a corporate negotiator closing a routine deal, she slid the document across the polished surface of the table until it rested directly under the warm glow of the chandelier, positioned perfectly between my coffee cup and my folded hands. "This is simply the authorship clarification form I mentioned earlier," Celia explained, her voice carrying a light, breezy tone that stood in stark contrast to the heavy silence in the room. "It just unifies the internal project records before the foundation finalizes their press releases for the gala. We thought it best to get the paperwork out of the way tonight, so Thursday can be entirely focused on celebrating your father." Theodore suddenly found the intricate floral pattern on his dessert plate incredibly fascinating, refusing to look up. My father shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the hallway as if contemplating a sudden emergency that might require his immediate presence at the hospital. I did not immediately reach for the document. I let it sit there for a long moment, allowing the uncomfortable silence to stretch and wrap itself around the three of them. Then, with deliberate slowness, I picked up the pages and began to read the dense, legalistic text. The document bore the official letterhead of the hospital's Research Integrity Board, though it had clearly been drafted by a private public relations or legal team. It was not a simple administrative update. It was a comprehensive surrender of intellectual property. I read the clauses carefully, my mind categorizing the lies with the same clinical precision I used to sort corrupted hospital data. Clause 3 explicitly identified Dr. Theodore Hartwell as the co-founder and primary clinical architect of the predictive model. Clause 4 stated that I, Serena Campbell, had acted solely in a technical support capacity, executing data entry tasks under the direct supervision and guidance of the lead authors. The final clause was perhaps the most damaging. It required my signature to certify that any previous misunderstandings regarding project attribution had been amicably resolved through internal family mediation, waiving any future right to formally dispute the authorship with the hospital's ethical committee. I lowered the pages, placing them back onto the mahogany table and aligning the edges perfectly parallel with the edge of the wood. I did not raise my voice, and I did not allow my hands to shake. I turned my attention entirely to my stepbrother. "Theo, could you explain how the American Society of Anesthesiologists' physical status classification, the ASA score, is weighted against patient age within the primary risk stratification algorithm?" Theodore's head snapped up, a flush of deep crimson creeping rapidly from his collar up his neck. He opened his mouth, but no immediate words came out. He looked at my father for a lifeline, then back at me, attempting to summon the confident persona he wore so easily in the hospital corridors. Well, the ASE score is a vital clinical indicator of baseline health, Theo began, using a tone of forced authority that sounded remarkably hollow. We integrate it into the general patient profile to ensure the post-operative care team understands the holistic risk before the patient even leaves the surgical theater. It is about treating the whole patient, not just the data. It was a beautiful, politician-style answer that completely failed to address the mathematical reality of the algorithm. Before I could point out that his answer had absolutely nothing to do with algorithmic weighting or predictive modeling, Celia reached across the table and tapped her manicured fingernail sharply against the wood. "Serena, please," Celia interrupted, her warm facade finally cracking to reveal the hardened steel beneath. "This is not a university oral exam. We are not here to debate the technical minutiae of a hospital spreadsheet. We are here to finalize a family agreement." "It is not a spreadsheet," I replied smoothly, maintaining my focus on Theo's flushed face. "It is a machine learning algorithm that predicts respiratory failure. And the person claiming to be its primary clinical architect cannot explain its most heavily weighted variable." My father finally abandoned his pretense of distance and leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the table. He looked older in that moment, the overhead light catching the deep lines around his eyes and the exhaustion in his posture. "Serena, just sign the paper," Malcolm said, his voice dropping into a low, pleading register. "You lose absolutely nothing by doing this. Your position at the hospital is secure. Theo needs this opportunity for the Harrington Fellowship, and the committee demands a clean, uncomplicated narrative. I am asking you to do this for the family." I looked at the man who had built a celebrated career on the concept of saving hearts, realizing how little he understood about mine. He knew the document was a fabricated lie, and yet he was sitting in his own dining room, asking me to happily sacrifice my professional integrity to build a pedestal for a son who did not belong to him. "I lose the truth," I stated simply, the words falling into the room like heavy stones. Celia released a sharp, exasperated breath, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms defensively. "You are always so terribly cold about these things, Serena. You view everything through the lens of rigid numbers. Your father is about to be honored for a lifetime of service to medicine. Cannot you put your ego aside and let him have one peaceful, uncomplicated night?" They were employing every psychological mechanism they possessed: guilt, familial obligation, accusations of selfishness, to corner me into compliance. I did not argue. I did not attempt to defend my character or explain the thousands of hours I had spent building the system they were trying to steal. Instead, I reached out and picked up the stack of papers, folding them neatly down the middle. I slipped the document securely into my leather handbag, the clasp settling into place with a definitive finality. "I will take this home to read it more carefully," I said, rising smoothly from my chair and picking up my coat. "Thank you for the dinner, Celia." The lamb was very well prepared. No one attempted to stop me as I walked out of the dining room. Aunt Rosalind met me in the hallway, silently handing me my keys with a look of quiet solidarity. When I finally returned to my apartment on the South Bank, the city was entirely dark, the lights of London reflecting softly across the surface of the Thames outside my window. I did not turn on the main lights in my living room. I sat down at my desk, illuminated only by the cool, blue glow of my computer monitor, and reached into the bottom drawer to retrieve the small, silver-encrypted hard drive. I connected the drive to my terminal, entering the complex sequence of alphanumeric passwords required to unlock the internal partitions. I did not open the files to plot revenge or out of a sudden surge of anger. I opened them out of a deeply ingrained professional habit. In the world of data governance, when someone attempts to rewrite history, you secure the original logs. The screen populated with a meticulously organized hierarchy of folders. I reviewed the original anonymized patient datasets, the initial Python scripts, and the subsequent hundreds of version histories. I opened the security logs, verifying the cryptographic hashes that proved exactly when each file was created, when it was modified, and who had accessed the internal server. At the very bottom of the directory was a small PDF file, the original project memorandum I had drafted 3 years ago, outlining the necessity of the dashboard to the hospital board. The subject line of the memo, written long before Celia or Theo had ever involved themselves in my work, read, "Do not let the data become decoration." They believed that a single sheet of paper and a manufactured family narrative could overwrite 3 years of digital reality. They believed that because I had remained quiet throughout the dinner, I had accepted my defeat. But as I watched the audit log scroll steadily across my monitor, detailing every single keystroke that had built the hospital's most successful safety initiative, I felt a profound, clarifying sense of peace. The system possessed a flawless memory, and the system remembered exactly who I was. Chapter 7. Audit Logs Do Not Flatter. The transition from the suffocating psychological theater of my family's dining room to the sterile, brightly lit environment of St. Cuthbert's NHS Trust was always a profound relief. When I arrived at my basement office on Monday morning, I did not seek out my colleagues in the staff break room to vent about my weekend. I did not recount the humiliating dinner or the legal document currently sitting in my leather handbag. In the world of clinical data analysis, emotional outbursts are entirely useless variables. They do not solve the equation, and they certainly do not correct a corrupted system. I turned on my dual monitors, watching the hospital's internal network authenticate my credentials. My strategy was not rooted in vengeance. I had no desire to humiliate my father or destroy my stepbrother's nascent career. I simply required the institutional machinery to function exactly as it was designed to function. I opened my email client and drafted a message to Marcus Ellery, the head of information governance for the trust. Marcus was a meticulous, deeply serious man who treated patient data with the reverence most people reserved for religious artifacts. He was entirely disconnected from the social hierarchy of the surgical wards, making him the perfect, neutral arbiter of truth. I typed the email with careful, deliberate precision, ensuring every word adhered to professional protocol. Dear Marcus, I am currently reviewing the governance and compliance frameworks for our departmental predictive modeling initiatives. Could you please clarify the standard hospital procedure in the event of a formal authorship or attribution dispute regarding a patient safety project that utilizes anonymized hospital data? Best regards, Serena Campbell, MSc, Lead Clinical Data Analyst. I sent the message and immediately returned to my daily tasks, running a routine query on the weekend post-operative recovery rates. The numbers were stable, a direct result of the system I had built. Less than 40 minutes later, a notification appeared on my screen. Marcus had replied. His response was exactly what I expected, a structured, heavily cited explanation of hospital policy. He explained that any project utilizing St. Cuthbert's patient data was legally bound to a centralized digital repository. This repository maintained an immutable audit log, tracking every single change, approval, and version history from the moment the project folder was created. If there were any credible suspicions of manipulated attribution, the Research Integrity Office possessed the absolute authority to open a formal investigation, freeze the project assets, and review the metadata. I read through his email twice, noting the specific institutional pathways. I did not immediately file a formal complaint. Doing so without my father actually presenting the fraudulent narrative at the awards gala would only allow Celia to claim it was a simple administrative misunderstanding. I needed to secure the reality before they had the chance to permanently alter the narrative. I replied to Marcus, adopting the standard tone of routine administrative maintenance. Thank you for the clarification, Marcus. As the primary creator of the Campbell Surgical Insight Repository, I am formally requesting a complete, cryptographically signed export of the project's entire history, including all access logs, commit timestamps, and user contribution metrics. I am compiling a comprehensive technical archive prior to the upcoming awards ceremony. Because my administrative privileges identified me as the absolute architect of the dashboard, Marcus approved the request without a single follow-up question. 2 hours later, a secure transfer link arrived in my inbox. I watched the progress bar inch across my screen, downloading gigabytes of irrefutable evidence. The file contained every line of code I had written, every statistical model I had refined, and every timestamp that proved Theodore Hartwell had never even opened the primary analytics folder. While the data compiled, the screen of my mobile phone illuminated the surface of my desk. Celia had begun her secondary campaign. The texts arrived sporadically throughout the afternoon, carefully constructed to alternate between maternal affection and subtle, menacing pressure. Good morning, darling. I hope you slept well after that lovely dinner. Please consider what we discussed last night. Your father is under an immense amount of pressure this week with the gala approaching. Theo looks up to you so much, Serena. He practically sees you as an older sister. He would be devastated if you made this difficult for him. A signature on a piece of paper changes absolutely nothing about how much we value you behind closed doors. I read each message as it appeared, my expression remaining entirely neutral. I did not type a single reply. Engaging with her would only provide her with ammunition, allowing her to twist my words and frame me as a difficult, combative daughter. Her final message arrived just as the secure data transfer completed its download on my computer. Family doesn't need audit logs to know who did what. We simply protect our own. I stared at that final sentence for a very long time, the words blurring slightly against the bright screen of my phone. Family doesn't need audit logs. It was the ultimate distillation of Celia's worldview. She genuinely believed that reality was completely malleable, that the truth was nothing more than a flexible concept dictated by whoever held the most influence in the room. The profound arrogance of that text message transported me instantly back to a memory of my mother. I was 14 years old, sitting at the kitchen island while Margot reviewed a disastrously managed patient file from a negligent junior doctor. The doctor had attempted to cover up a missed medication dosage by retroactively altering his handwritten notes. My mother had spent 3 hours cross-referencing pharmacy dispensing records to prove the discrepancy. When I asked her why she was going through so much trouble instead of just letting the senior physicians handle it, she had stopped writing and looked at me with an intensity one had never forgotten. Because the truth does not protect itself, Serena, she had told me, her voice steady and resolute. People who construct lies will always try to convince you that documenting the facts is an act of hostility. But decent people are never afraid of accurate records. I placed my phone face down on the desk, the memory of her voice solidifying my resolve. I was not being hostile. I was simply refusing to participate in a comfortable fiction. I opened the hospital's secure network directory and located the administrative schedule for Dr. Priya Nair, the chair of the Research Ethics and Integrity Committee. Dr. Nair was a formidable physician with a reputation for absolute intolerance toward academic dishonesty. I selected an available 30-minute window on Friday morning, the day immediately following the Royal College of Surgeons Gala. I typed a brief, thoroughly professional meeting subject, consultation regarding data governance and authorship integrity within the Surgical Insight Initiative. I submitted the meeting request and waited for the automated confirmation. I was not launching a preemptive strike to ruin my father's evening. I was simply ensuring that when they inevitably demanded I endorse their lie, I had a perfectly structured, institutionally recognized mechanism ready to catch the fallout. I transferred the massive, cryptographically secured export file from the hospital network directly onto my silver encrypted hard drive. I then opened my email application and printed the entire exchange I had just conducted with Marcus Ellery, ensuring the time and date stamps were clearly visible on the paper. Finally, I printed screenshots of Celia's text messages, transforming her digital manipulation into tangible, undeniable physical evidence. I placed the printed documents into a thick blue folder, sliding the silver hard drive into the internal pocket. I locked the folder inside the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the heavy metal mechanism settling into place with a definitive, satisfying weight. Celia and my father had spent the last several weeks carefully curating a beautiful, heartwarming story for the press and the fellowship committee. They had arranged the lighting, written the script, and assigned me the role of the silent, accommodating background character. They believed that because I had never shouted or caused a public scene, I was incapable of defending myself. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the work I did. An audit log does not know how to be polite. A cryptographic hash does not care about family loyalty, and a server timestamp cannot be intimidated by a public relations consultant. The system possessed an absolute, unyielding memory. All I had to do was step aside and let it speak. Chapter 8: The Night of the Chosen Names. The Royal College of Surgeons was a fortress of scientific prestige, its formidable stone facade imposing against the damp London evening. Inside the grand foyer, the atmosphere was entirely distinct from the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the hospitals where most of the attendees spent their working lives. Here, the air was heavily perfumed with expensive cologne and the scent of intricate floral arrangements. A string quartet played softly from a raised balcony, their notes floating over the low, sophisticated murmur of the medical elite. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in elegant evening gowns moved smoothly across the marble floors, exchanging polite pleasantries and quietly calculating one another's professional influence. I arrived shortly after the initial reception had begun, having deliberately chosen to bypass the red carpet photographs near the entrance. I wore a dark navy dress with a high neckline, a garment selected specifically for its absolute lack of remarkable features. I had no desire to draw the attention of the event photographers or the journalists from the medical journals. I simply wanted to observe the architecture of the lie my family had constructed. Hanging securely from my shoulder was my leather handbag, its weight reassuring against my side. Inside the inner zippered pocket rested the small, silver-encrypted hard drive containing the hospital's immutable audit logs, resting directly beside the impeccably folded, utterly unsigned authorship clarification form. I navigated through the crowd toward the grand hall, locating our assigned seats at table 4, positioned prominently near the front stage. My father and Celia had already arrived and were currently engaged in conversation with the chief executive of a pharmaceutical company. Celia noticed my approach immediately. Even from 10 yards away, I could see the rapid, calculating assessment taking place behind her perfectly curated smile. She excused herself from the executive and glided over to intercept me before I could reach the table. She stopped in front of me, her eyes sweeping over my navy dress and simple hair arrangement. She reached out, adjusting a virtually invisible wrinkle on my shoulder. "You look fine, Serena," Celia murmured, her tone carrying the precise cadence of a backhanded compliment. "Very sensible. Just remember to maintain a pleasant expression when the cameras circulate the tables. We want to project a cohesive, supportive image tonight." I did not thank her for the fashion assessment. I simply nodded slightly, moving past her to take my seat at the table. My father sat down a moment later, wiping a faint sheen of perspiration from his forehead with a linen napkin. The ambient temperature in the hall was perfectly regulated, but the sheer volume of his anxiety was beginning to manifest physically. He looked at me, then looked deliberately at my handbag resting on the empty chair beside me. "Did you bring the documents, Serena?" Malcolm asked, his voice dropping into a low, strained whisper so the neighboring tables would not overhear. "I brought it," I answered calmly, looking at the elaborate crystal centerpiece occupying the middle of our table. "And is it signed?" he pressed, leaning closer, the scent of his expensive aftershave suddenly overpowering. I turned my head to look directly into his eyes. "It remains exactly as it was when I left your dining room, Father." Malcolm closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second. When he opened them, the familiar, weary disappointment had returned. "Please, Serena, do not make a scene tonight. Do not ruin this evening. I have worked my entire life to stand on that stage." "I have no intention of making a scene," I replied, my voice remaining perfectly level and devoid of any dramatic inflection. "I am merely attending a dinner to which I was invited. The only thing that could ruin this evening is a failure to accurately represent the truth." Before my father could formulate a response, Theodore arrived at our table. He was practically radiating the arrogant, untethered confidence of a man who firmly believed his own manufactured press releases. He was accompanied by 2 junior surgical residents who looked at him with the wide-eyed reverence usually reserved for attending physicians. "It really all comes down to understanding the clinical intuition behind the numbers," Theodore was explaining to the young residents, gesturing grandly with his champagne flute. "Growing up watching my stepfather in the operating theater, you realize that data is just the modern scalpel. You have to know where to cut the variables, how to slice through the noise to find the patient's true risk profile. That was the inspiration I brought to the architecture. I sat completely still, listening to a 27-year-old resident who barely understood how to log into the hospital's secure network casually claim ownership over 3 years of my exhaustive statistical modeling. He used the terminology like a child wearing his father's oversized suit, throwing around words like variables and architecture, without possessing even a foundational understanding of their structural meaning. The junior surgeons nodded in rapt attention, entirely captivated by his performance. Theo finally noticed me sitting at the table. He offered a bright, entirely unbothered smile, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Serena, glad you could make it out of the basement to see how the other half lives." "I wouldn't miss it," I said quietly. The junior residents offered polite, dismissive nods in my direction before excusing themselves to find their own seats. Theo adjusted his cuffs, entirely oblivious to the profound risk currently sitting inside my handbag. He believed the battle had already been won simply because I had not screamed at him in his mother's dining room. The low hum of conversation in the room suddenly shifted, the crowd parting slightly to accommodate the arrival of Dr. Priya Nair. As the chair of the Research Ethics and Integrity Committee for the Regional Health Trust, Dr. Nair possessed a reputation that preceded her. She was a woman of uncompromising standards, possessing a brilliant medical mind and an absolute intolerance for the political maneuvering that often plagued large hospital networks. She was dressed in an elegant charcoal suit, moving with a quiet, undeniable authority. Celia spotted her immediately and adjusted her posture, stepping forward to intercept the doctor with her most welcoming, politically calibrated smile. "Dr. Nair, how wonderful to see you this evening," Celia began, her voice projecting warm familiarity. "Malcolm and Theodore are simply thrilled that you could attend. It means so much to the family to have the ethics board validating the initiative." Dr. Nair stopped, offering Celia a polite but remarkably brief nod. She did not return the effusive warmth. Instead, her sharp, intelligent eyes bypassed Celia entirely and scanned the seating arrangement until they landed directly on me. To the absolute horror of my stepmother, Dr. Nair stepped around Celia and approached my side of the table. "Miss Campbell," Dr. Nair said, extending a hand. Her voice was crisp, professional, and loud enough for everyone at our table to hear perfectly. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you in person. I rarely get to interact with the technical architects behind these initiatives." I stood up, accepting her handshake. Her grip was firm and steady. "The pleasure is mine, Dr. Nair. I appreciate you taking the time to review the hospital's data systems." Celia quickly moved to stand beside Dr. Nair, a tight, forced laugh escaping her throat. "Oh, Serena is our quiet little background worker. She was so helpful to Malcolm and Theo in organizing the spreadsheets for their vision." Dr. Nair turned her head slowly to look at Celia, her expression remaining entirely neutral, though the temperature in her eyes seemed to drop several degrees. "Spreadsheets," Dr. Nair repeated, testing the word as if it left an unpleasant taste. She turned her attention back to me, ignoring Celia completely. "I reviewed the original technical documentation you submitted to the internal server last year, Miss Campbell. The way you weighted the patient comorbidities against the weekend nursing rotas was not simply helpful organization. It was an exceptionally robust, entirely independent piece of risk stratification. It is rare to see an analyst isolate the variables with such clinical precision." The silence that fell over table 4 was absolute and suffocating. My father stared at his empty water glass, his jaw tight. Theodore looked confused, his limited technical vocabulary failing to process the exact magnitude of Dr. Nair's compliment. Celia's smile remained frozen on her face, but the skin around her eyes had tightened to the point of strain. She recognized the profound danger standing in front of her. Dr. Nair had just casually confirmed that she had read the original, unaltered repository files, the files that bore only my name. "Thank you, Dr. Nair," I said softly, holding her gaze. "It is gratifying to know the original methodology is understood." Dr. Nair offered a small, deeply knowing smile. She glanced briefly at my father, who still refused to look up, before nodding to me once more. I look forward to discussing the governance protocols of the project in the future. Enjoy the evening, Miss Campbell. Dr. Nair turned and walked toward the VIP section near the stage, leaving a devastated, electrified silence in her wake. Celia slowly exhaled a shaky breath, her composure fracturing for the first time all evening. She turned to my father, her voice an urgent, harsh whisper. Malcolm, what did she mean by the original documentation? I thought you said the internal servers were updated with Theodore's name. They were, Malcolm hissed back, his panic finally breaking through the surface. The public-facing folders were updated. I don't know what she was looking at. She was looking at the audit logs, I stated clearly, sitting back down and resting my hands on my lap. The system tracks the creation and modification history of every algorithmic model utilized by the hospital. It is a standard compliance requirement. Celia turned to me, her eyes entirely devoid of their usual faux-maternal warmth. They were sharp, furious, and calculating. You need to sign that form, Serena. You need to sign it right now, before he gets on that stage, or you are going to humiliate this entire family. Before I could answer, the heavy crystal chandeliers above us began to dim. The string quartet concluded their final movement, and a commanding voice echoed through the high-fidelity sound system, asking the guests to take their seats for the commencement of the awards ceremony. The truth was no longer hidden in a basement office or buried beneath a public relations newsletter. It had walked directly up to our table, dressed in a charcoal suit, and left a warning that could not be ignored. My family had built a magnificent, towering stage out of my labor, and as the spotlight finally illuminated the podium, they realized they were standing on entirely fractured ground. Chapter 9: My Father's Speech. The heavy crystal chandeliers suspended above the grand hall gradually dimmed until their warm, golden glow was entirely extinguished, leaving only the sharp, focused illumination of the spotlights directed at the main stage. The ambient hum of sophisticated conversation faded into an attentive silence as the master of ceremonies, a distinguished older gentleman with a resonant, theatrical voice, approached the podium. He tapped the microphone lightly, the subtle amplification echoing through the vast architecture of the room, and began reading from a gilded presentation card. He meticulously listed my father's decades of surgical achievements, referencing the complex valve replacements and the countless hours spent inside the operating theater, systematically building a towering monument of professional reverence before formally introducing him as the recipient of the Vanguard in Clinical Innovation Award. My father stood up from his chair, buttoning his tailored dinner jacket with a practiced, elegant fluidity. He walked up the carpeted stairs to the stage, bathing in the blinding white light that separated the celebrated from the spectators. Standing behind the polished wooden podium, he looked exactly like the medical patriarch Celia had spent over a decade carefully constructing, authoritative, deeply compassionate, and flawlessly composed. He adjusted the angle of the microphone, allowing a perfectly timed, heavy moment of silence to settle over the audience before he drew a breath to speak. He began his address by speaking about the sacred, unspoken trust established between a cardiovascular surgeon and a patient. He spoke eloquently about the terrifying vulnerability of a human being lying unconscious on an operating table and the crushing, continuous responsibility of ensuring their safety long after the anesthesia had worn off. I sat completely still at table 4, my hands folded together in my lap, listening to the steady, practiced cadence of his voice. There was a brief, highly irrational moment where a very small, remarkably persistent part of my memory, the memory of a young girl who used to wait up in the kitchen for him to return from exhausting night shifts, hoped he would look out into the darkness of the audience and simply tell the truth. Instead, he smoothly shifted the focus of his narrative toward the Campbell-Hartwell Surgical Insight Initiative. He gripped the outer edges of the podium, leaning forward slightly to project an air of deep, personal sincerity to the representatives of the research foundation seated in the front rows. He graciously thanked the hospital board for their generous funding and their belief in modernizing post-operative care, and then he deliberately turned his attention to his family. None of this complex architecture of patient safety would have ever reached the light of day without the unwavering support of my brilliant wife, Celia, Malcolm announced, his deep voice radiating warmly through the massive acoustic speakers. She possesses the incredibly rare ability to look at a mountain of cold, clinical statistics and instantly recognize the human story waiting underneath. She consistently reminded me that numbers only truly matter when they are actively saving a life. The audience responded with a soft, collective murmur of appreciation, charmed by the display of spousal devotion. Malcolm paused, allowing the warmth of the room to swell, before turning his body slightly to direct his gaze specifically toward our table. But true innovation requires a dedicated bridge to the future, he continued, his tone elevating with a manufactured, overwhelming pride. When we first conceptualized the foundational structure for this predictive risk model, it was the fresh, unburdened perspective of Dr. Theodore Hartwell that truly elevated the framework into something revolutionary. Theodore is a remarkable young surgeon with an intuitive grasp of patient needs. He is the young man who reminded me that a professional legacy is not merely a matter of genetics, but of the shared purpose found in those who choose to walk the same demanding path. The entire room erupted into a wave of sustained, enthusiastic applause. I watched Theodore lower his head in a display of perfectly choreographed humility, offering a modest smile as he accepted congratulatory pats on the shoulder from the junior residents seated at the adjacent tables. My father stood bathed in the adulation, waiting patiently for the applause to naturally recede before adding one final, dismissive administrative afterthought. I must also express my gratitude to the dedicated data support team working quietly in the hospital basement, whose tireless formatting and administrative assistance allowed our broader clinical vision to become a functional reality. He did not say my name. He did not mention the lead data analyst. Not once. He had stood before the highest echelon of his chosen profession, surrounded by the people who dictated the future of medical research in the country, and publicly declared my stepbrother as his intellectual and spiritual heir. He had reduced my 3 years of rigorous algorithmic engineering, my countless nights cross-referencing weekend rotas with respiratory failure rates, to the role of a nameless, interchangeable clerk. The profound insult did not register in my chest as a sudden, sharp pain, and it did not provoke any desire to stand up and scream. Instead, it felt exactly like a heavy, suffocating lead blanket settling permanently over my shoulders, effectively extinguishing the very last, stubborn ember of familial loyalty I had been carrying for 17 years. The man speaking on the stage was no longer my father. He was simply a hospital administrator delivering a public relations script. Malcolm descended the stairs to a standing ovation, returning to our table looking profoundly relieved, the heavy sheen of anxiety completely gone from his face. The string quartet immediately resumed playing a lively, sophisticated classical piece as the catering staff emerged from the service doors to begin clearing the dessert plates. Under the protective cover of the rising ambient noise and the shifting of chairs, Celia leaned closely into my personal space. She opened the golden clasp of her designer clutch and produced the thinly folded authorship clarification form, sliding it smoothly across the linen tablecloth until the crisp white edge touched the base of my water glass. "That was a truly beautiful, historic moment for your father, Serena," Celia murmured, her voice tight with an aggressive urgency she was struggling to conceal after Dr. Nair's highly threatening visit to our table. "Now that the speech has been officially delivered to the foundation board, everything is perfectly set in motion. Signing the document right now is the most elegant, sensible way forward. Once you provide your signature, the administrative files will perfectly match the public narrative." I looked down at the legal document resting against the crystal glass, tracing the invisible lines of the trap they had spent weeks building, before slowly shifting my gaze to meet her perfectly lined eyes. "Are you asking me to ensure the paperwork matches the truth, Celia, or are you asking me to ensure it matches your carefully curated story?" Celia maintained her rigid, photograph-ready smile, though the muscles along her jawline visibly clenched under the severe cosmetic tension. She leaned marginally closer, dropping the pretense of maternal affection entirely. In rooms exactly like this, Serena, surrounded by the people who control the vast majority of medical funding in this city, the truth and the story are exactly the same thing, Celia stated, her voice dropping into a cold, hardened register. They only become different when someone decides to be intentionally difficult and actively ruin the evening for everyone else who has worked so hard to build this family. She was entirely wrong, of course. The story she had constructed was a remarkably fragile architecture of stage lighting, well-rehearsed speeches, and carefully cropped photographs in hospital newsletters, utterly dependent on my continued, silent submission to maintain its structural integrity. The truth was currently resting securely inside the encrypted silver drive hidden within my handbag, entirely immune to her sophisticated public relations strategies and psychological manipulation. I did not pick up the silver pen she had forcefully placed beside the document. I left the paper lying exactly where she had pushed it, turning my attention toward the front of the hall. I simply sat in the beautiful, gilded room and waited for the master of ceremonies to announce the transition to the private VIP reception suite, where the representatives from the Harrington Surgical Fellowship and the Foundation Board were waiting to formally finalize the institutional records. Chapter 10. I do not sign. The private VIP reception suite at the Royal College of Surgeons was a masterclass in architectural intimidation. Located behind the main gallery, the room featured floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves holding leather-bound historical medical texts, deep emerald velvet drapes, and a massive, polished oak table under a dim crystal chandelier. It was a space designed for institutional closures, where major grants were finalized, high-level fellowships were vetted, and sensitive political arrangements within the health trust were quietly codified. Celia had orchestrated the assembly with her usual tactical precision. Present in the room were Dr. Priya Nair, representing the Research Ethics and Integrity Committee, Julian Vance, the Senior Administrative Director of the Private Research Foundation funding the initiative, my father, Theodore, and myself. The thin, folded authorship clarification form was extracted from my handbag and placed directly onto the center of the oak table by Celia's steady hand. She smoothed out the crease with the edge of her thumb, her smile perfectly intact, though her voice carried a distinct, sharp edge. Now that the public celebration has concluded, we can finalize the formal documentation for Julian's foundation and Theodore's fellowship file, Celia announced, her eyes locking onto mine with an unyielding intensity. It is a simple family clarification form, Julian. We wanted to ensure that the internal repository records perfectly align with the generational vision Malcolm presented on stage tonight. Serena, the pen is right beside you. The silver fountain pen rested on the polished wood, reflecting the dim light of the chandelier. The room fell into an expectant, heavy silence. My father looked at the bookshelf, refusing to meet my eyes, while Theodore adjusted his cuffs, his breathing shallow but rapid. I did not pick up the pen. I placed both hands flat on the edge of the table, my posture entirely relaxed, my voice dropping into the quiet, level register I used when presenting statistical data to a hospital audit board. I cannot sign this document, I said, letting the words settle into the room like heavy stones. I cannot sign it because the content typed on these pages is entirely fraudulent. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian Vance frowned, his pen pausing over his own legal pad, while Celia's frozen smile instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp rigidness. Serena, please, Celia said, her voice dropping into a harsh, menacing whisper. We discussed this at dinner. This is not the time or the place for your petty, personal resentments. You are embarrassing your father in front of the board. I am not expressing resentment, Celia. I am stating an administrative fact, I replied, looking directly at Julian Vance. This document asserts that Dr. Theodore Hartwell is the co-founder and primary clinical data architect of the Predictive Modeling Initiative. It further states that my role was limited to clerical data entry under his direct supervision. None of those statements are true. Theodore's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He leaned forward, slamming his hand lightly against the table. Serena, that is completely absurd. I spent months analyzing the clinical profiles. I was the one who provided the medical context for the entire risk stratification model. Dr. Priya Nair raised a single hand, her sharp, intelligent eyes locked onto Theodore. The room instantly quieted at her gesture. Dr. Hartwell, Dr. Nair said, her voice crisp and dangerous. Since you are the primary clinical architect, perhaps you can explain the integration of the data. The repository utilizes a specific logistic regression formula to weight the American Society of Anesthesiologists score against the postoperative respiratory metrics. Can you dictate the primary variables used to calculate that specific variance? Theodore opened his mouth, his chest puffing out of pure habit, but no coherent words emerged. He stammered, his limited technical vocabulary failing him entirely. The variables, well, we look at the patient's baseline respiratory rate, obviously. And the intraoperative vitals are cross-referenced with the standard recovery logs. It's a holistic clinical approach. That is a marketing summary, Dr. Hartwell, not a mathematical architecture, Dr. Nair stated coldly. She turned her head toward me. Miss Campbell, please clarify. I did not look at Theodore. I opened my handbag, retrieved the silver encrypted hard drive, and slid it across the table until it rested directly in front of Julian Vance. Beside it, I placed a printed, cryptographically signed export of the project's entire security repository, which I had secured from Marcus Ellery earlier that week. The project repository was established 3 years ago under my institutional credentials, I explained, my voice remaining perfectly calm and level. The security logs inside that file contain the immutable history of every single commit, modification, and data query executed since the inception of the initiative. Over 36 months, there are exactly 412 development logs. 398 of those logs were authored exclusively by my user account. I paused, allowing Julian Vance to flip open the folder. The crisp white pages detailed rows of server timestamps, cryptographic hashes, and user IDs. The remaining 14 logs, I continued, were authored by my father's clinical account during the initial medical sponsorship phase. Dr. Theodore Hartwell's credentials do not appear a single time in the system architecture until 3 weeks ago, when his account was added to the standard read-only distribution list for the final marketing summary. This is a complete misrepresentation of how a medical family operates. Celia cut in, her voice rising in pitch as she attempted to regain control of the room. She turned to Julian Vance, her hands gesturing frantically. Julian, you must understand, Serena is a data technician. She handles the background mechanics. The intellectual inspiration, the vision, the actual direction of the project belong to Malcolm and Theodore. This is an internal family matter that she is weaponizing out of spite. In the realm of medical research and institutional funding, Mrs. Campbell, there is no such thing as an internal family matter, Julian Vance said, his voice entirely devoid of its earlier warmth. He looked down at the server logs, his expression hardening. My foundation does not fund visions. We fund verifiable scientific data. And according to these security hashes, your son has never touched the system he just claimed to inspire on the main stage. Dr. Nair pulled a secondary document from her briefcase. It was a printed copy of the internal email metadata I had flagged. She adjusted her glasses, reading the text aloud into the suffocating quiet of the room. On May 14th, Mrs. Campbell, you sent an email from your personal medical communications account to Dr. Malcolm Campbell's private server, Dr. Nair read, her voice entirely flat. The text reads as follows. We need Theodore to be significantly more visible in the final presentation if we want the Harrington Committee to take his application seriously. Serena will not object to the adjustments if you frame it as a necessary sacrifice for the family legacy. My father looked down at his hands, his face entirely pale, the celebrated confidence he wore on stage completely shattered. Theodore sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at the printed email as if it were a physical weapon. Dr. Nair slid the paper back into her folder, her gaze shifting between my father and Celia. In the context of the NHS Trust and the Royal College of Surgeons, misrepresenting research authorship is not a creative public relations strategy, Mrs. Campbell. It is a severe breach of research integrity and professional ethics. Julian Vance stood up, closing his leather folio with a definitive, sharp snap that echoed off the mahogany bookshelves. He looked at my father with a mixture of professional coldness and profound disappointment. The Foundation is halting the issuance of the Vanguard Award immediately, pending a full, independent forensic audit of the project's development history by the Information Governance Department, Vance announced. He turned to Theodore, his eyes narrowing. Furthermore, I will be personally contacting the selection chair for the Harrington Surgical Fellowship tonight. Your application will be frozen until this investigation is formally concluded. Julian, please, my father stammered, his voice cracking as he finally looked up, his hands trembling slightly against the edge of the table. We can correct the filing. We can adjust the names on the final publication. There is no need to jeopardize the hospital's funding over an administrative miscommunication. This is not a miscommunication, Malcolm. This is a documented fabrication, Vance replied coldly, walking toward the heavy emerald drapes of the exit. Good night. As the door clicked shut behind Julian Vance, the room collapsed into an oppressive, suffocating silence. Celia stood entirely still, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides, the carefully curated public image she had spent 17 years perfecting completely dismantled in less than 15 minutes. My father turned his head slowly to look at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic mixture of anger and confusion. Do you have any idea what you have just done, Serena? You have ruined my standing with the Foundation. You have destroyed your brother's future before it even began. Why couldn't you just keep this within the family? I stood up, pulling my navy coat over my shoulders and picking up my handbag. I looked at the man who had allowed my mother's memory to be packed into cardboard boxes, the man who had stood on a brightly lit stage and reduced my entire life's work to the background chores of a nameless clerk. I didn't destroy anything, Father, I said, my voice entirely calm, entirely at peace. I simply refused to sign my name to a lie. The consequences you are facing are not the result of my actions. They are the exact, logical weight of your own records. I turned and walked out of the VIP suite, my heels clicking steadily against the marble floor of the grand corridor, leaving the three of them alone in the quiet dark of the mahogany room. Chapter 11. The Consequences Without the Noise. The fallout from that evening did not arrive as a series of dramatic, shouting confrontations or public scenes. In the structured world of high-level medicine and public administration, consequences manifest as a slow, systematic dismantling of authority through official letterheads, formal notifications, and locked access codes. 3 weeks after the gala at the Royal College of Surgeons, the institutional machinery of St. Cuthbert's NHS Trust had executed its processes with clinical precision. The first consequence landed on my father's desk in the form of an official memorandum from the executive board. The Vanguard in Clinical Innovation Award was permanently rescinded, the Foundation's funding for the upcoming fiscal year placed under strict administrative escrow. A formal internal investigation into research misconduct was initiated, and my father was temporarily stripped of his clinical oversight duties, restricted to routine surgical procedures under the direct supervision of an independent medical auditor. The celebrated icon of the cardiovascular wing had been reduced to a high-risk liability. The second consequence dismantled Theodore's carefully mapped future. The selection committee for the Harrington Surgical Fellowship did not issue a formal rejection. They simply canceled his interview cycle entirely, citing a failure to meet the baseline integrity requirements of the application process. His rotation at St. Cuthbert's became a silent, humiliating ordeal. The junior residents who had swarmed around him at the gala now avoided him in the corridors, their professional instincts telling them that his proximity was toxic to their own careers. Celia's retraction from power was perhaps the most complete. The Trust's communications department initiated a comprehensive review of conflict of interest violations, resulting in the immediate termination of her public relations contract with the hospital network. She was formally barred from entering the administrative or clinical wings of the facility. The woman who had built an entire career on the manipulation of public perception was completely stripped of her access, her keys, and her ability to control the narrative. My mobile phone, which had once been a conduit for Celia's calculated, pressurized text messages, now populated with entirely different data. The family group chat, which had been silent for months, became a chaotic ledger of blame. Malcolm, how could you let this happen? You were supposed to manage the server access. Theodore, stop screaming at your mother. We are trying to find a legal solution. Serena has completely blocked my number. She is destroying this family out of pure malice. I exported the chat logs into a secure backup folder on my private computer, my expression entirely neutral as I archived their panic. I did not reply to a single message, and I did not answer the frantic, late-night phone calls from my father's private line. One evening, a brief, unexpectedly candid email arrived in my inbox from Theodore's personal account. Serena, I know you won't answer my calls. I just wanted to say, I didn't know the extent of the email my mother sent to Malcolm. I knew I didn't build the algorithm, but they told me it was standard practice to elevate the clinical lead. They told me you didn't care about the spotlight. I let them say things that weren't true because I wanted the fellowship. I am sorry for my part in it. I read the message twice. It was a pathetic, self-serving confession, an attempt to mitigate his own guilt now that his career was in ruins, but it was an admission nonetheless. I did not type a message of forgiveness, and I did not delete it. I simply dragged the email into the master archive folder, creating a digital record of his acknowledgement. On Saturday morning, Aunt Rosalind came to my apartment on the South Bank. She did not bring up the internal investigation or the heavy tension paralyzing the Islington house. Instead, she carried a small, vintage wicker basket filled with fresh pastries and a delicate, faded silk scarf that had belonged to my mother, Margot. We sat by the window, watching the gray morning light reflect off the surface of the Thames. Rosalind reached across the small table, placing her hand gently over mine. Her skin was lined, her grip warm and reminiscent of the steady composure she had maintained during her decades as a head surgical nurse. Your mother always said that Malcolm was a magnificent surgeon when a patient was open on his table, Rosalind said softly, her eyes looking out over the water. He could fix a physical valve with absolute perfection, but the moment the chest was closed, he was completely blind to the human mechanics of his own home. He thought he could manage people the way he managed a hospital staff, by assigning roles and expecting absolute compliance. I looked down at the silk scarf in my lap, tracing the intricate, hand-stitched floral patterns along the border. I did not cry, and I did not feel a sudden surge of bitter satisfaction. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound sense of space. I spent 17 years attempting to fit into the margins they drew for me, Rosalind, I said quietly, my voice steady in the quiet room. I stayed quiet because I thought my silence was protecting his memory of my mother. I thought if I was functional enough, low maintenance enough, he would eventually remember that I belonged there. You never belonged in their margins, Serena, Rosalind replied, her voice firm and unyielding. Margot didn't raise you to be a background character in a public relations campaign. You kept the records accurate. That is the highest form of respect you could have shown to her memory. When she left, the apartment returned to a deep, undisturbed quiet. I folded my mother's scarf neatly, placing it inside the bottom drawer of my desk beside the silver encrypted hard drive. The storm had broken over the Islington house, but the debris was entirely theirs to clear. For the first time in my life, I was no longer the person assigned to clean up their mistakes. Chapter 12, My Name Where I Place It. The rain had cleared by Monday morning, leaving the streets of Manchester glistening under a pale, crisp northern sun. I walked into the convention center, my credentials resting securely against my navy blazer. I had accepted an invitation from the National Health Governance Board to present the predictive risk model at their annual Patient Safety Symposium. The auditorium was vast, filled with hundreds of clinical directors, data scientists, and administrative leads from healthcare trusts across the country. There were no crystal chandeliers or expensive champagne flutes here. The room was lit by clean, functional white light, populated by professionals who spent their lives analyzing systemic efficiency and patient outcomes. When my name was called, I walked up the steps to the stage, moving with a calm, unhurried precision. I adjusted the microphone at the podium and looked out into the audience. I did not feel the crushing weight of family expectations or the suffocating pressure of a manufactured narrative. I was standing entirely on the foundation of my own competence. I clicked the remote, and the massive digital screen behind me illuminated the hall. The very first slide displayed the official title of the presentation in clean, bold typography. The Predictive Risk Stratification Architecture for Postoperative Complications Lead Author, Serena Campbell, MSc, St. Cuthbert's NHS Trust. I did not deliver a speech about legacy, and I did not reference family devotion. I spoke entirely about the data. For 45 minutes, I guided the audience through the Python scripts, the logistical regression models, and the exact methodology I had used to isolate the weekend staffing variables. I explained how the system function protected human lives by translating scattered medical records into verifiable, predictive alerts. An accurate record is not a decorative administrative tool, I concluded, my voice echoing clearly through the high-fidelity sound system of the auditorium. In the context of patient safety and clinical research, accurate attribution is the fundamental baseline of professional integrity. If we allow our data to be manipulated to serve a more convenient public narrative, we are not simply misrepresenting our work, we are breaking the primary contract of healthcare. The applause that followed was not the polite, social adulation of an evening gala. It was the sharp, appreciative response of peers who recognized the rigorous discipline required to build something real. After the session concluded, I descended the stage to find a small group of young data analysts waiting near the podium. Among them was a young woman, perhaps 24 years old, wearing a hospital trust badge and holding a digital notebook. She looked at me with a mixture of professional reverence and quiet excitement. "Miss Campbell," she said, her voice hesitant but clear. "I've spent the last 2 years working in the administrative basement of my trust, formatting spreadsheets for the senior consultants. I didn't know that someone from data analysis could stand on a stage like this and completely own the architecture. Thank you for showing us what is possible." I offered her a genuine, unforced smile, shaking her hand firmly. The architecture belongs to the person who writes the code that is verified by the logs. Never let anyone convince you that documenting your own data is an act of selfishness. Her words anchored themselves in my mind as I walked back to my hotel room later that afternoon, providing a deeper, more permanent sense of validation than my father's praise ever could have achieved. While waiting for my train back to London at Piccadilly Station, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. It was a direct text message from my father. "Serena, the internal audit will be finalized next week. I am willing to concede the primary authorship on the formal publication if we can issue a joint statement to the foundation to restore the funding. Let us have lunch tomorrow at the club to discuss how we can resolve this family misunderstanding." I stared at the glowing text on the screen as the high-speed train pulled into the platform, the brakes settling with a steady, low hum against the tracks. He was still attempting to negotiate reality. He was still calling an intentional, multi-year theft a family misunderstanding, still trying to lure me back into a private room to fix a system he had broken. I typed a single, final response, ensuring the parameters of my boundaries were entirely non-negotiable. "I am available to meet you in a public space, Father. We will not be joined by Celia. We will not be discussing the reinstatement of foundation funding, and you will not refer to the truth as a family injury. If those conditions are acceptable, I can do Tuesday afternoon." I pressed send and placed the phone face down in my bag. I did not wait for his reply. I knew that he might never truly understand the magnitude of his failure, and he might spend the rest of his life believing I was the cold, unyielding daughter who destroyed his legacy. But for the first time in my 34 years, I realized that his understanding was an entirely irrelevant variable. I did not need his comprehension to be whole. I boarded the train, taking my seat by the window as the carriage began to glide smoothly out of the station, leaving the rain-slicked platforms of Manchester behind. I leaned my head back against the seat, looking out at the vast, open landscape of the English countryside rolling past the glass. My value did not become real because they finally had to admit it in a mahogany boardroom. My work did not gain meaning because my name was finally printed on a presentation slide. I did not leave my family. I only left the suffocating, silent role they had forced me to play for 17 years. For the first time in my life, my silence was not a terrified surrender to their control. My silence was peace, and my name was exactly where I had chosen to place it: on the work I build, on the truth I protect, and on the life I am finally free to live on my own terms.